Welcome, streamers, to the Fifth Estate at the Wheeler Centre, and it's such a pleasure to be with you right now. My name is Sally Warhaft, and an even greater pleasure to welcome our guest this evening, George Megalogenis. George is, of course, an author, a journalist, and, well, the person that we most wanted to hear from right now at this special streaming event. So welcome to you all, and if you're tweeting, you can get in on the Wheeler Centre hashtag, which is hashtag TWC. George, great to see you. Thanks for being here with us in this streaming hall, in this incredible, astonishing moment in history.
It's surreal. It's surreal. Welcome. Thank you, Sally. And I miss the audience. We have to point out.
Yeah. There's.
We're live streaming, but in an empty auditorium.
Indeed, and we do miss you, but we know you're out there. George, let's start with history, because the coronavirus, of course, doesn't compare to any moment in world history. We've never had an event that every human being has shared in real time in one way or another. And I wonder, even though it is a novel crisis, what moments in history have you thought of with various aspects of this story? What have you gone back to time and again in thinking about it?
In terms of global pandemics, this is a once in a century event, but as you point out, in a very unique setting. Whereas the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919, at the end of the First World War, you had returned soldiers bringing the virus back to nation states and it then spreading locally. But the spread was a lot slower. It killed a lot of people. It killed an awful number of people, and there was two waves, one in 1918 and one in 1919. This thing, though, has done something which there's no comparable setting for it. It's basically shut down this thing called the global economy. And it's shut it down cold, and it's done it so quickly that I don't have a parallel for it. I don't have a parallel for first China going off the grid, then Europe, then the United States, and then suddenly the entire world going off the grid. And with governments telling their people that the next 3 to 6 months is essentially a lockdown. So fighting what is, as all politicians say, is a health crisis, and nation states going on war footings, but there's also an economic crisis which wraps into it very, very quickly. Once you tell a people that 60, 70, 80, 90% of the real economy has to stop work cold, to stop the spread of this infection, you are in depression territory almost overnight. With unemployment rates. In fact, the unemployment rate is almost a meaningless calculation to make, but you could very easily get from 10 to 20 to 30 very quickly. And the reason you get there so quickly is the health task is to shut down your economy. It's to stop people interacting. It's to stop people going to restaurants. It's to stop people getting on aeroplanes. It's to stop people being in the normal consumer-supplier contact.
So let's talk about the government here, the Australian government response and its policies to now, and your sense of how the government has done and this scalable response.
That's a terrific word, scalable. I wondered when
It's a terrible word, really.
It's an awful word. So look, you and I are both nerds, so we're paid to interpret jargon and put it into simple English. Scalable is a phrase I hadn't heard before, and it isn't what you do, obviously, to a fish before you put it in an oven or on a frying pan. It is the idea that we're in an unprecedented decision-making period and we have scope to continue to make unprecedented decisions. It's a really, even that doesn't explain it. What Scott Morrison was intending with that phrase was, I'm going to start big and then it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And in terms of the economic response, I'll talk about the economic response first, because if you were to track a graph of the stimulus measures, now there's now been 4, they do rise exponentially from a couple of million from a couple of billion to 130 billion, and it's happened in record time over the last couple of weeks. I don't think that's what he intended when he said scalable, but he's lucky that he left himself that out, that they were going to be making policy on the run. And if I was to assess, I'm taking the economics first because the economics is the thing that's been front of mind for everybody for the last couple of weeks. Once we started going into that shutdown, once you couldn't go to the football, once you couldn't go to a restaurant, once you couldn't leave your own suburb, it very quickly became apparent that there was no income coming in for a lot of people. And the government looked at it as a GFC, global financial crisis kind of transaction in the first instance. They pulled a couple of levers that Kevin Rudd had pulled in 2008 and didn't get any bounce. There was no sense in the community that suddenly the government was going to see me through this thing. Because by the government's own rhetoric, they were talking 6 months of lockdown, 6 months of constrained, community activity, 6 months of constrained economic activity, but just to do a simple payment like the first lot of payments, and the first couple of payments were just a dole payment for pretty much anyone who wanted it, then doubling that payment, and then some tax relief for small business. Those things weren't even going to get you to next week, and in fact, that money wasn't going to turn up in your account until sometime. In fact, I think they were shocked at how complex relationships were in the real world. And you think politicians would understand these things better, but they were shocked that what they were offering had literally no traction.
So just no sense at all of how most people live in the lack of savings and...
Well, it's not even the lack of savings. So assume Australia is one of the most indebted households on the planet at the moment. So that should have been an alarm bell ringing off in your policy brain. But the other part of it is just the 6 months. You think about all the fixed costs in a 6 month period. You've got your gas, your electricity, you've got your telephone, you've got your internet. And of course, if you're isolated at home, these are things you're going to be relying on increasingly. But you've got no money coming in. For parents with kids in school, you've got school fees.
So what about what they've done since, and particularly the really big announcement yesterday about the job keepers and so on?
Yeah, so yesterday was the day that they finally got the idea that because they're asking for an epic sacrifice, you needed an epic transaction of support to match it. And I've been banging on about this for the last couple of weeks. I feel like one of those sort of internet shills sort of jumping up and down going, but what about this other stuff? As I say, the first couple of stimulus packages left so many people out, and also the money being offered wasn't enough to tide them over for 3 to 6 months. This thing is very generous for a number of people, especially lower income workers. So we're talking about now this JobKeeper allowance, which is paid directly to small business and a big business. There's means tests for big business. So basically anyone who's had to lay off staff or anyone who's had between 30 and 50% loss in income compared to the same period last year get this $1,500 a fortnight payment. And it's designed to hang on to a worker. And it is also designed to be given straight to a worker. So the number is big. 130 billion is a really, really big number, but on a per taxpayer basis, it's still not a big number. It's only $300 or $400 per taxpayer. And it's only really $10,000 over the 6 month period that you'll be giving money to tide people over. So it's not that big a thing for the individual household, but it's much bigger than the government's ever done before. Again, let's reference the GFC, right? Kevin Rudd gave us $1,000 to go shopping as an act of patriotic duty in Christmas. And you knew this money was coming and you knew what it was designed to do. And there was a couple of other stimulus measures, especially in the second wave. You're looking at school building program, Pink Bats, which obviously didn't go as well. But the way they configured the stimulus for GFC, it was cash and then infrastructure, with the Reserve Bank slashing interest rates on the way through. That was a 2-3 step transaction. This thing is much bigger than that because it's a different problem. I'm shutting the economy down to contain the spread of this virus. That if I don't contain the spread of this virus, I can't even begin to calculate as a Prime Minister or as a Treasurer what it's going to cost me to save lives. Because I'm going to lose too many anyway, and I'm going to overrun my health system before I know it, and I'm going to infect too many nurses and too many doctors, and I'm going to infect too many cleaners in hospitals, I'm going to infect too many people that I can save if I do this other thing, which is basically put the community and the economy in a deep freeze. Again, when you're doing that, you have to be able to tell people that I've got your back. And I've got your back is not $1,000 to go spending, because I don't want you to go spending.
Did it surprise you? Because it's been, the response has been from the government, it's been mixed, hasn't it? There's been clear, real errors of communication and muddiness and this incremental plan, you know, it's obviously the strategy. Was this a good response? Is it the right economic response?
This is a good way to frame the question, because if you think about the first response was clearly inadequate. The first response misunderstood what the government owed the community in return for the sacrifice it was asking the community. The government misunderstood that. And one of the reasons the government misunderstood it is I think they were still processing the shock of what it is that they were undertaking. So we went from a couple of weeks ago for Scott Morrison still arguing for his human right to go to a rugby league match before you and I couldn't go to the opening Richmond Carlton game the following Thursday. So he still wanted to go to a Sharks game on the Saturday, but we couldn't go to the MCG on the Thursday. If he's thinking that way, he hasn't, I can tell you, he hasn't computed yet. And when he was arguing for the right to go to the rugby league, the day before was that first of the so-called big stimulus measures, and it clearly didn't even touch the sides. But, and this is where I don't want to go to praising individuals because it's the collective that's pulled this off. In the last couple of weeks, they've gone from still shaking hands and wanting to go to the football and sending out all these mixed messages about what code alarm level we're at, to suddenly realising not only are we shutting this place down for up to 6 months, not only is the entire global economy going into recession, possible depression, and really quickly, we have to do something that is the equivalent in terms of our support in exchange for your sacrifice. So to take just 2 weeks to get there, I think is pretty good. And I've got to be honest about this. You can't be the person who called for this a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of people have been calling for this a couple of weeks ago, and then you get a turnaround within 2 weeks and suddenly you want to nitpick the detail. There are clearly a number of holes in the safety net, but as they draw up the legislation, they'll start to pick up other people. One of the things that's impressed me in the way the government has been forced to respond to this, what's impressed me is not so much that they've shed the ideology about debt and deficit, is that they have had 3 or 4, oh my God, I didn't realise it was that bad. And instead of pushing against it, a la Donald Trump, they've gone, all right, I need to scale up. And as I say, full marks for people learning on the run on this, because this is...
It's a shedding of ideology, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And is it the shedding of small government too? Is that over?
Okay, so small government. I think in their mind they still think that they'll run a small government in the recovery whenever that comes.
Oh, well, the recovery of that thought will probably come
so
in.
I think even in the next week it'll occur to them that suddenly they're responsible for indemnifying pretty much the entire real economy, with a couple of exceptions. And the exceptions are the things they're clearing the path for. They're clearing the path for health, essentially. So it is your classic, in economic terms, it's your classic command economy. It is a war economy. Pretty much everything else has been asked to get out of the way so we can do our best job on the health front. Now, John Curtin, when he ran a command economy during the Second World War, and this is the other parallel, you asked me about parallels. The funny thing about this is it's Spanish flu, Great Depression and the Second World War all wrapped into one. The one part of it that is tangible for people who do have memory of the Second World War is John Curtin shut down all essential industries. Women were put into the munitions factories and all the men were mobilised. And there wasn't a single idle transaction in the economy that wasn't devoted to either the war front or the home front. Now, of course, he was able to do that in the context of a full employment economy. He could plan a full employment economy for total war. This is total war on a health front, but with an extraordinary number of people been asked not to work. So this is the difference. This is why it's very tricky in terms of your precedents. You almost have to mix and match your epic examples from the past. So the health part of it, which is now the transaction that everybody is focused on, and we'll talk about the health response in a second. I just sort of want to tease out the economic argument first. The health response, for it to get right, in the short to medium term, they almost have to crash the economy by design. Now, how do you revive that economy after it's over? Well, everybody runs back into the street, has a VE Day celebration. We all start to hug our families again. We could feel safe hugging them. Now, could that be 6 months from now or 18 months from now? I'm not sure. They can't tell you, I couldn't tell you, and I wouldn't pretend to know. It doesn't feel like something that will suddenly revert to normal in the next 6 months. Now, during that period, let's say let's halve it at 12, not 18. And let's keep our fingers crossed that there isn't a second wave like there was a second pandemic with the Spanish flu in 1919, which took out more people than the first one did. Let's hope they declare mission accomplished, and it is mission accomplished, and it happens within 12 months, and the entire world can start to go back to some sort of normal business. A couple of things have already changed. There won't be as many people buzzing around the globe. At airports, they're going to be testing. So overseas travel is going to be slowed even if it comes back. Overseas migration will slow even if it comes back. And in fact, what we see across a lot of nation states is all the expats coming home. So a lot of Australians coming home, a lot of Chinese going back to China, a lot of Indians maybe going back to India. Question mark about where we end up after all those flows. But, you know, it's not normal, whatever it is that comes next, because first constraint is the tourism sector isn't going to be as strong. The second constraint is we don't have the free ride of migration. Now, in that context, but you've got a whole lot of people rushing to go back to work or to complete jobs that have been set aside. Even the health system's going to have a lot of elective surgery it's set aside. But you think about public infrastructure, you think about the electricity grid, the maintenance that has not been done now will have to be done to scale up, sorry to use the phrase, for when all the lights go back on in industry. That is a very, very complicated business, and you can't leave that to the market.
And there are endless examples of those.
So you can't. The reason why you can't leave it to the market, and think this thing through, it's a command economy now, i.e. a planned economy. The government's running the economy to all intents and purposes, and it's very heavy intervention for public health reasons. In the recovery, there has to be a very heavy intervention again to stop this thing blowing up in the recovery, to stop having an escalated run-up in demand, crowding out the good things you want the market to do. The market's not going to be able to function in the way that we understand it for a number of years. And economists understand this because when they look at your history outside of wars, there's a lot of planning that goes in for the reconstruction and recovery. And we're looking at a reconstruction, not a recovery. This isn't the Second World War for us where, you know, some bombs landed on Darwin, some bombs landed in Broome, but, you know, the Southeast was you know, got off scot-free in terms of action. It isn't one of those things. There's going to be scars all through the real economy. There's going to be physical scars for people who didn't make it. There are going to be scars for people who did make it but have their health compromised. There are going to be scars for people who weren't treated for other things because they couldn't be prioritised. And there are going to be scars out there in the community for people who, for the first time in their lives, have had to go 6, 12, 18 months without a job. So I think you're looking at the government, and whether it's a coalition government or a Labor government, who cares really? What we're actually been forced to think about in terms of public policy is a very, very active state for a long, long time. And weirdly, the way democracies work is an active state yields better information sometimes than a market yields. Now, this might be quite a controversial theory, but hear me out on this. What we've seen in the last couple of weeks is democracy working properly. So a stimulus package gets announced and half the workforce says, what about me? The Labor Party says, hang on a minute, everybody else is doing some sort of wage guarantee. Scott Morrison said, I'm not doing that. Labor says, hang on. Constituents tell the government, hang on, and before you know it, the government's changed course. I would expect we'd see a number of these things happen over the next few years. It doesn't really matter what the government is. We're going to find out really quickly where the bubbles are and where the gridlock is. And we don't want the bubbles to grow again. We certainly don't want to all be running back to have another property boom. That almost makes no sense, right? We certainly don't want to see the firms that did okay in this thing and didn't share any of the sacrifice suddenly make super profits. I can't see that happening. CEOs having sacrificed salary during the crisis, I can't see them reverting back to salaries that are many multiples, exponentially multiplying to the lowest paid worker in their workforce. I see a lot of things changing. What I can't tell you is what the change is, because a lot of the changes that will happen in the next few years will be the changes as the real world bumps back up against decision-making and against markets, with the real world and the government pulling rank over an unfettered market.
You mentioned John Curtin before, and I mean his endeavours in leadership in Australia during the war killed him. The burden of that, and be careful what you wish for.
It killed two of them too. It killed Roosevelt as well.
That's right.
Of the Allies.
That's right.
And there were two others.
And I'm
remember?
hoping it doesn't...
there was another guy called Churchill and then lost the next election.
That's
and
right.
There's another guy called Truman who dropped the atom bomb. He lost the next presidential election as well. So it's a short shelf life.
It's an amazing, it's like, the musical chairs and your numbers come up and now is the time to... This is what you were elected for, ultimately, isn't it? And,
hey, can I do something really gratuitous?
Sure.
So if a Scott Morrison or a Josh Frydenberg or even an Anthony Albanese or a Jim Chalmers were watching this now, or one of the premiers, I'd say assume that this is the last big thing you do in your political career. Just assume it. And in fact, stop worrying about your political future, because your job now is to get this right. And in fact, I want you to get...
Hasn't it been evident when they do? You can see them, the moments where they are thinking about it, and it's when the accidents happen or the miscommunications.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So there's a couple of things. I still think Scott Morrison's still adapting to the challenges, and they're very difficult challenges. You wouldn't want to be going to work every day wondering whether this graph would get out of control and suddenly your hospital system, your health system's overwhelmed. You just don't want to be that person. And that's a very heavy responsibility to have. And at the same time, you're basically jettisoning everything you ever believed in to deal with this crisis. Every now and then you do see, the old Morrison comes in, he wants to litigate with the journo, wants to tell the journo to bugger off. He doesn't want to do this or he doesn't want to do that, but he's adapting. And as I said, and this is why I've mentioned to all leaders, and I don't want to sound like too pompous about this, but the sooner they get past the thinking politically, and you've alluded to this yourself, the better decisions they'll make now, and their kids and their grandkids are going to thank them for it. Anything else, any political calculation, if they still hear themselves thinking politically, if the communications minister for EG, Paul Fletcher's a lovely bloke, but if he's thinking, as soon as we're out of this, I'm going to gut the ABC anyway, you're not thinking right. For EG, just a random example. If you're thinking as a treasurer, here's a good chance to deunionise the workforce, or as an industrial relations minister, or you're thinking as a finance minister, what the hell, I'm going to slash public service pay for here until eternity. Everybody else is making a sacrifice. I'm going to take 20% off their salary for the rest of times. It'll look great on my balance sheet. Anytime you think like that, forget it. You're not actually treating this crisis with all the earnest endeavour that you need. But of course, once you stop thinking politically, it releases you, and you end up making better decisions anyway.
A fascinating aspect of this in Australia, but elsewhere as well, particularly America, but in Italy, everywhere where the lens has been the role of, in Australia, of course, it's premiers and chief ministers. In other places, it's mayors and so on. It's been little of the city mayors. I've felt it's been very much the level of state and premier. And this has obviously been a shock for the feds. I think
you're putting it mildly. Of the multiple shocks, the governance shock is probably the one that they didn't see coming.
Yeah.
So,
what does that mean? What are the repercussions of that? Because they're having a festival of leadership in various degrees of success around Australia, but they're not going to want to give up this.
No, I don't think they will. I was a bit sceptical about the national cabinet model to begin with, but as it's adapted, I think it's not a bad idea. It's probably a better way to run it, honestly, than to release the 151 parliamentarians in the short term to get back on their hobby horses. And I think this sort of decision making, this is a bit analogous to that Gang of Four during the GFC crisis, which was Prime Minister, the Treasurer, Finance Minister, and the Deputy Prime Minister. So Rudd, Swan, Tanner, and Gillard. This obviously has got much more firepower because you have jurisdiction and you have power. So Commonwealth has the chequebook and the states are responsible for the health system. You have to collaborate, and you have to collaborate as equals. And it's pretty apparent to me that the difficulty Morrison had at the start was he thought he was in charge of all the premiers and chief ministers. And they realised very quickly that his national interest, which is to try and take this thing relatively slowly, wasn't matching with some of the advice they're getting from their state health advisors, especially Victoria and New South Wales, which are the epicenter, especially Sydney, which is the epicentre of the outbreak in Australia. And you could feel the premiers going, hang on a minute. In the end, if our hospital system is overrun, it's me, it's on me, it's not on him. And that part of that arm wrestle, and again, to Morrison's credit, he's accommodated it. I mean, there's been a bit of a sort of backbiting between Morrison's office and the New South Wales government. We haven't mentioned the Ruby Princess yet, but there's obviously been, it didn't occur to either jurisdiction to stop a boat. So
funny.
Even though we're jettisoning ideology on the economic front, I would have thought border protection was the one constant through this whole period.
Of all the boats that have been promised to stop in this man's history, this was the one boat that mattered.
But it didn't. But apparently neither was responsible for it. The Port Authority and the Health Department in New South Wales are primarily responsible, but that's a gap in coordination. Anyway, let's put that to one side. Your question is about the power structure in Australia. Premiers are emboldened, and you want them to be in the crisis. In the recovery, what does that mean? What does that mean? It's an interesting question.
It is, because the kitchen cabinet that you referred to during the GFC, which happened very early in Rudd's tenure, and I always felt that one of the greatest problems, the flaw of Rudd's tenure, was that they never got out of that crisis mode.
Yes.
And that was the problem with not speaking more broadly to the cabinet and to the caucus.
Yeah.
And so that too will be an important part of coming out of this, how the government reacts to not being in crisis mode.
Yeah, although except in this instance, they're still going to be having to run the economy in a way that they haven't run it outside of the Second World War in the 50s and 60s.
So
that's the difference. Yeah.
How do you think they're going to think about recovering the economy in a sort of a slightly longer? I've got 5-year-old twins. Yeah. A month ago, there was sort of assumptions you could make if all goes well in life that they might finish school if I'm lucky, and they might go to university, and who knows, who knows. Yeah. Now everything about the future of our children suddenly feels very unknown, and I mean it weighs upon it generationally as well. So what would you feel safely saying with some certainty about what might be different about their lives?
Yeah. So I think one of the sort of generational observations is, because this is hitting boomers because they're vulnerable because of the age profile. Gen X, which sort of never got to take over the world, people of our generation, probably a little too polite, sort of waiting for power to be handed over to them. Our kids' generation, Generation Zoom, if we can call them that.
That's a very polite way to put it.
Yeah. George. Generation Zoom, at the moment, been very, very radicalised by the coronavirus. Your kids are maybe a little too young, but they're going to be affected by it. But if you've got teenage kids or you've got kids at uni, they're very quickly going to want to take the world over, and they're going to want to take it over at the earliest available opportunity. Whereas you and I might have waited, we had no political aspirations, but people in our generation didn't necessarily think this way. It was all about career paths and fitting in. I think they're going to grab the world by the scruff of the neck. They're going to be weirdly like that Curtin generation that lived through the First World War, and Curtin, of course, was on the front line of the conscription debate, which split the Labor Party in two. He enters Parliament in 29. He's only a oncer because they're out by 31. Split again by the Depression. By the time he gets to run the country in a Second World War and then plans for a recovery, even though the war itself kills him, he's learnt everything. And I think that generation, your kids' generation, are going to make much better decisions, I think, in the next 10 or 20 years when that group is in charge, because of what they've lived through. And what they've lived through is 3 crises. in the space of the last 20 years. So that sort of 2001 shock of September 11 and all those unnecessary wars, especially in Iraq. I don't want to talk about Afghanistan, but that thing's going to end up as another score draw for the US and the Allies. The global financial crisis, the environment, home ownership, just the affordability of Western life, all those issues, even before we reach the pandemic, have been drilled into their subconscious. And they spend a lot of time looking at us, wondering why we haven't fixed it. And they certainly look at the boomers going, well, okay, boomer is what they say. And no disrespect to the boomers watching the stream here, but you think about it in terms of generational power shift, you are looking at a generation that is going to do quite dramatic things compared to the cohort that sort of came into the world at the end of the 60s, into the 70s. Part of that bubble had free education in Australia at the tertiary level. A lot of them are sort of indebted before they start working. I think you're looking at a radically different country. What's going to change? Okay, one thing that now is such an obvious question to have, and if you think about the cycle we've been through, a summer of fires, a black summer of fires, going into a pandemic, and if we are in a position to declare mission accomplished by the end of this year or next year, and there's another bushfire season, and you don't talk about climate change at that point and take it seriously, you're dead politically. So I think that's one of the things you'll notice, a very, very big change. And in fact, it actually suits government to think in terms of reconstruction about sorting out the climate issue now. And in fact, I'd be very disappointed if the current coalition government didn't just stare down the 10% of crazies on their backbench about this issue. There's no way you would go into reconstruction now wanting to let carbon emissions rip again. Because I can guarantee you most other countries will have sorted this issue out, and if we remain the only country that doesn't want to do anything about it or pretends it doesn't affect us and then calls for relief when our fireys are overwhelmed, the world is not going to give us a break on that.
It's also a reminder at the moment that when something terrible is upon us, we are capable of making decisions and enacting policies that are wildly unexpected to the way you may have hoped or thought or things might go.
I think what it does, and not that you would wish this particular crisis on anyone. I have to say, even though I'm not a working journalist in the way when I used to work at a newspaper, but I find it a very difficult subject to separate myself as a professional from. I get to write about it, so I'm not on zero income at the moment, but I'm not going to be earning much in the next 6 months like most people. But every time I'm looking at the subject matter, I can't separate my fears for family and friends. It's not the same as covering a war or covering an election campaign, God help us, where you can put in 5 or 6 weeks of heavy duty, a tour of duty, knowing that the rest of the world is sane and all the arrangements in terms of care and other things are sorted out for you. You clock up your days owing and then you come back and you crash for 2 weeks and have a good time binging on something. This is not that sort of story. Every living, breathing minute of it, you're still making calculations about your livelihood. You're still making calculations about the health of your parents.
And the health of yourself. And
yes, and it's so that part of it is just really, really tricky. But the interesting thing is I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a decision maker. It is interesting to observe how uncluttered their thinking is forced to become. So all that little stuff, all the culture war stuff, all the sort of score settling and all the other stuff that has been such a dominant part of politics on both sides for the last 20 years. How pathetic does it look? It feels really pathetic, and you almost hear them, as I said before, if they still hear themselves thinking politically, they're not on task. They're not focused. I'm using their jargon here. Basically, they're not treating it with the seriousness it deserves. So I think the possibility for making really, really big and epic decisions is clarified by the nature of the challenge. So you can look at climate change and think, it's going to rain, so we're not going to have a summer quite like the last one. And maybe I can get to an election without another drought, without another, apocalypse, right? That's presumably how Morrison would have been thinking, and especially he'd have a chip on his shoulder about the way the media treated him and the way, people in the fire zone treated him when he turned up to shake their hand. So you can sort of understand that, but not now. And
No
in
more
fact,
shaking hands now.
well, he wouldn't be shaking hands, absolutely, but not now. Would you be calculating how do I keep the crazies on Sky After Dark at bay on this thing? And he will be talking in the G20 context, even though he's zooming it. They're not face to face because they can't shake hands or breathe on each other, of course, because Boris Johnson's got it now, unfortunately.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm wishing him a speedy recovery. But you would think in that peer group, they're not all looking at each other going, how can I pinch another election by not doing anything? No, they're not thinking that way now. And this is, as I said, you wouldn't wish this on a society. You certainly wouldn't wish this on a planet that has been as connected as this particular planet. And a lot of people in the West argue about globalisation, and there's good reason to view this phase of globalisation as not being in the interests of poor people and the middle class and most rich societies. You get increase in inequality in rich societies, but global inequality is shrinking because a lot more people have been joining the middle class in the last 20 years. Most of it, obviously, from China. You want to be able to maintain some element of that in the reconstruction. You don't want a winner-take-all world in the reconstruction. And you don't want, obviously, you're not going to get politics as usual, but the one thing you do need to guard against is the temptation once governments get to pull levers again, because this is one of the weird things about the last 10 to 20 years. There hasn't been that many levers that actually pull. This is why they revert to culture war. This is why they revert to appointment wars. This is why they try to intimidate the ABC into giving a crazy on the right airtime, because there's been nothing else to do. Now there's everything to do, and I guess the balances between ambition and democracy is probably the best way to describe it. So there's not total control
For
in the
each
future.
place to succeed, it also is, it's sort of the greatest need of trust that the world has really, I guess there was the Cold War, but that was a few people. This is everybody that's in charge of this trust.
I don't think the political system clearly, the virus isn't hunting out people's approval ratings. It isn't doing that. It isn't hunting out, the weak primary votes of the main parties. The virus doesn't have a mind of its own. It is what it is. But this thing has turned up at a particular time in global history, and you can't avoid the time that it's turned up in. It's turned up in a time where politics is theatre, almost like a form of professional wrestling, abusive, anti-intellectual, excessively macho. That brand of politics, and conducted by a group of people who, as we know from some of the decisions they made early on with the stimulus on the coalition side, aren't connected enough to the real world to understand the complexity of human relations and economic relations. So this particular group, of course, when you measure trust in government and trust in politicians, it's at record lows in Australia. It's comparable to the period of the dismissal in 1975, which was not just political anarchy but economic anarchy as well. Industrial disputes, 10% unemployment, 10%. We're heading to 10% unemployment. We're already double-digit inflation. So we're at a very, very vulnerable time politically. A government might think, well, none of that matters because I will earn trust via the epic decisions I make from now on. I don't think that's right. And in fact, I think, especially in the age we're in, because it's quite a cynical age, there'll be questions and questions and questions about whether you could have done this better. Now, we haven't talked at all about the health equation, and partly because I'm not an expert, but understand politically in the end, it's unfortunately the body count, so the number of people who died, that will determine whether the country went well or not. At the moment we're looking at, because we're reacting in real time, we're looking at bending curves, at bending caseloads. But we don't know, we know what the numerator is, we know the number of cases, we know the number who've died. We actually don't know the denominator because we haven't tested everyone. So we don't know how many people have got the thing and how many more people are going to get it. We don't know either of those things. But when this thing is passed, and say the Americans lose 200,000 or more, and say Australia loses not 20 or 50, but thousands and 10,000s, no one's going to view this as mission accomplished. People will then be asking the question, how the hell did we let this thing get out of hand? And you can already hear these questions being asked in real time in the US. In fact, so much so, in fact, can we talk about Trump for just 5 seconds?
Let's.
Just 5 seconds.
Yeah.
The man is clearly an irredeemable narcissist, right? It's impossible to redeem a character like that who's still calculating everything selfishly at this moment in this story. He goes from saying it's not a problem, it's a hoax. Okay, he realises it's real. A couple of days he wants to be the war president, thinks, oh, that'll look good in the newsreels. And then a couple of days later, he's arguing, oh, look, if we get it under 200,000, I would consider that success. No. Everything is still politics for him, and that's your counterfactual to the way our system is working. And in fact, the nitpicking about whether Morrison, should have spent as much time in the weeds as he did about hairdressers, I'd much rather have that guy at the moment than the guy who thinks it's okay to one day say it'll go away, it's just one person from China, to, look, if I can keep it under 200,000, re-elect me.
It's astonishing, isn't it?
But, I mean, seriously, what... Before we get back onto the health, if you think about the global order, the thing about the last 20 years for Australia, the first 10 of those 20 years of the 21st century, America and China went to work on our behalf. So China wasn't testing the international order, so America had our back strategically, whilst the Chinese were raising our incomes and also, adding extraordinary diversity to our population through the migration program. So both those countries were kind of in lockstep on our behalf. And you think about it, we're less than 2% of the world's population. The two largest economies and the two military powers in the world basically go to work each day on Australia's behalf. Now, they didn't design it this way, but that was the happy accident of that first decade. GFC has the Chinese going, here's a chance to overtake the Americans. Suddenly, the second decade is China and America butting heads because the Americans pushed back. Not just Trump, of course, because Obama was starting to push back as well. And so Australia suddenly goes from a position of how is it that the superpowers are all going to work on our behalf to suddenly they're going to force us to choose between them. Right now, the thing about the coronavirus is that both America and China are the two systems that have brought this onto the planet. The Chinese didn't recognise it early enough, maybe recognised it but suppressed it for political reasons. We were frightened by their response, which is why we shut the borders very quickly to arrivals from China. The Americans didn't take it seriously enough, and suddenly their caseload has exceeded China's, the second epicentre. Europe obviously still is a big epicentre, but basically between America and China, they've shown us that they can't govern the globe, whether in friendly cooperation or competition. So Australia gets this thing going for it at the moment. It suddenly doesn't need to suck up to either of those two countries. We need them in a way, but we're not going to have to think about them for the next 12 to 18 months because our borders are closed. We are going to be governing on our own behalf, and it's going to be difficult, but we're going to be governing on our own behalf for a fair while. In fact, this cycle and the next political cycle are going to be about decisions made locally, and our international relations are going to be in freeze.
And that'll be true for the whole world.
Well, every constituent part of the globe is going to be in a position like that. Look, there'll be some bad actors that think, okay, I might invade a country now, and there'll be some other bad actors who'll think, well, both of you, well, they'll be picking on one, not the other. Everyone wants to poke America in the eye at the moment. And look, even if the Americans sort themselves out by the end of the year, you wouldn't trust them. And in fact, if you're an official in Australia now, the health people can now swap notes with the Treasury people, because the Treasury people will tell you that no one saw the GFC coming in a way because everyone assumed that the Americans wouldn't do the crazy things that they did.
One of the regrettable decisions was not closing the borders to Americans much earlier,
so
wasn't it?
we were alluding before to in the end, unfortunately, the death toll is the thing that's going to determine the health response. It is pretty clear to me that our medical officials were anxious quickly enough for the Chinese threat. And I talk about the contagion, not China as a country of all its people. I'm talking about the source of the virus through travel. They were they were quick off the mark on that, but they didn't sense the equivalent danger in the US. And in fact, you have to ask yourself the question, so do you as a health official, sorry, I touched my face then, not supposed to touch my face, do you as a health official get the China pandemic risk and then are blind to the US pandemic risk, because you assume the American health system was in good nick? You knew it wasn't in good nick, come on, you're kidding me. Is the other reason you're a bit slow because you didn't want to offend them? Possibly, I understand that. It's not a decision that health officials should make, by the way. It's unfortunately a decision a Prime Minister makes. But, I mean, those graphs are out there. It was obvious at the American trajectory, even before Scott Morrison still wanted to go to the footy, it was obvious the week before that they were tracking faster than Iran at that point, and they were in exponential growth. And it didn't take long for everybody, and New Zealand went first, remember, locked them down. We should have closed our borders a good 2 weeks earlier. And in fact, we'll never know. No. We'll never know, unfortunately, if we could have bought enough time. Now, remember, our winter's still ahead of us. This is the thing that makes me feel awful about this entire story is you can almost feel a muddle through a version of a lucky country going on, because this is a northern outbreak in their winter, and we get advance notice.
And as usual in Australia, we don't quite take the advantage of these gifts that we could to their fullest extent. It's been our national story for decades now.
So I'm not going to be triumphalist about it, but I would say that the economic response, a week ago I wouldn't have said this. A week ago I would have said, it looks like the health thing is working a bit better than the economics. I'm more wary of the health response now, only because you just don't know how much community spread there is. And look, episodes like the Ruby Princess doesn't make you any more trusting in the coordination, for want of a better term. But the economic response, because it is escalating to a position where a couple of weeks ago it seemed radical, and now it seems logical. So I think we're adapting much faster in the economics, and maybe that says something about us as a country, that we are able to get that material transaction right in the short to medium term. But the sacrifice transaction, which is really what the health thing is, and the part of the sacrifice which was difficult, I think, for politics to make, is to just go it alone. And of course, if you knew that every country was going to go it alone a fortnight later, you'd hop in the time tunnel and you would say, at the beginning of March, everybody arrives from overseas, automatic quarantine, set the testing regime up at the airports, set the testing regime up at the ports, and then hopefully try to test every person in the world. There is something, some egotists in sort of the bureaucracy or governments might be thinking this already, but there is some truth to this. The countries that do best, if you think about their global brand at the other end of it, it isn't, I mean, your survival instinct is to keep the death count as low as is possible, but you still want to be one of those countries that people talk about that have done it right. You know, South Korea, Singapore, Japan maybe, Denmark. Australia wants to be in that category. It doesn't want to be not as bad as Britain, or certainly not as bad as Italy, but, you know, the same.
Somewhere in between South Korea and Italy, or
or Germany, somewhere between Germany and Denmark even. You don't want to be that country. You want to be an exceptional country, because, for God's sake, you tell yourself all the time that you're a great people. We tell ourselves. It's almost...
Well, I mean, with advantages in this particular...
Well,
to be a continent...
To a continent in the right season.
With a health system that...
And a health system.
Is superior to many, many others.
But we won't know. But see, we won't know we won't know until winter whether the caseload is low and the infection rate is theoretically lower because of the season. There is so much we still don't know about this virus. We are finding out a lot really quickly, and... So here's the thing that we didn't have 100 years ago during the Spanish flu. You couldn't have people doing the exponential graphs in real time. You couldn't have media organisations with the tools to do really, really high-level analysis. You didn't have the information sharing between countries that we have now. You certainly didn't have the information sharing between national health departments, one to the other. Chinese sending lessons to Europe and to Australia and to the US, and the Americans, the part of the system that is working, sending lessons elsewhere, collaborations on coding the thing, collaborations on testing, collaborations on hopefully the cure. You know, we are weirdly in a much better place, but of course the other thing that's unprecedented is the spread is exponential, simply because of the number of people who buzz around the globe on a daily basis, or have been buzzing around the globe on a daily basis.
George, it's
quite exhausting, isn't it?
It's just a remarkable thing to talk to you about it, your long range, both backwards and forwards in your thinking. It's really something. Thank you, and we'll look out for your written words as this goes on. And to those of you streaming, thank you. We can get back to our living rooms and you can get on with your evenings. For those of you that sent in questions, I've tried to incorporate some of what you sent in into the questions tonight, and we can keep the conversation going on Twitter and elsewhere. Please check into the Wheeler Centre website. They've got the most astonishing archive, I think, really in the country of contemporary talks and so on, perhaps after the national broadcaster, but a lot of long form, enough to keep you going for weeks and months, and also